So that's always been a core belief of mine. And it's one of the things that I think about when I'm evaluating jobs. Like, am I going to have integrity in this job? Do I feel as though the CEO and others on the leadership team have that level of integrity? How do I live that? So that's part of the intentionality. Part of the intentionality is also showing up in a way that is me. But what I'm aware of is that I am a fallible human and that I make mistakes and can learn. Authenticity is one of the words that I know we're sort of talking about a little bit, but that is such a tricky word because for some people, their authentic stance, right, their tendencies may not actually be aligned with good leadership. They may be very brash. So being intentional and authentic don't always go together.
Hey everyone, welcome to Leadership Rounds, a podcast shining a spotlight on exceptional clinician executives thriving and driving innovation at the intersection of business and healthcare. I'm your host, Dr. Reena Pande, and together we'll explore the wisdom and insights of great healthcare executives and craft a prescription for leadership success, one candid conversation at a time.
Dana, I am so grateful to you for joining me here on this podcast today. This has been maybe not a long time coming, but I've been looking forward to it for a long time. As you know, and other listeners know, this is like a little bit of a passion project for me to use this podcast to shine a bright spotlight on phenomenal clinician leaders, and to really be able to show how people like you are able to marry the clinical acumen with the business acumen to really drive innovation. And we need more people like you. So thrilled to have you joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you, Reena. It's great to be here. And I've been super excited about this as well. So very much looking forward to it.
I love it. So as our listeners may know, you are now, as of recently, the Chief Clinical Officer at a wonderful digital health company called Nourish, which you'll tell us more about in a little bit, but have spent some time in operating roles at companies like Headspace and Ginger, and then, practicing psychologist in your early days of your career. I am taking some pride in the fact that I think you're the first non-physician clinician to be on the podcast with me. And I just love that because I think there's great clinicians of all shapes and sizes and clinical licensure. But I want to just open by letting you tell your story because it's a neat one. You've gone from clinician to operations leader in multiple businesses and led teams at massive scale. So just tell us how you got from point A to point B.
Yes. Well, it was a sort of convoluted story with lots of turns in the road, as is often the case. There really was no telehealth when I was getting started, or if there was, it was maybe an occasional phone call, but that was it. So I was working as a provider in many different settings for probably 15 years or so. A lot of that was in private practice, in Philadelphia, in New Mexico. I worked a lot in college counseling. I love university-aged college students are so fun. And then a lot in eating disorders. But I have this memory, and this was at many different settings, but basically of coming out into the waiting room to get a client to bring back for session and just being overwhelmed and thinking there is no way we're going to meet this need. The waiting room would be packed. And knowing the number of clinicians we had on staff, I knew people were going to be waiting. They were going to use urgent services because they couldn't get an appointment. It just wasn't a good system. So I was aware that the one-to-one clinical model was not effective. So I started to get really thoughtful and excited about how can I scale myself? How can we use data? What would this really look like to innovate on care? My husband had recently started at Grand Rounds. He was already in HealthTech, and he came across this posting for this company called Ginger.io, and he sent it my way and started looking into it and talked to other people. And everyone sort of thought I was crazy because I had this very stable university job. And I was telling my parents, and my dad's like, please send me the contract because I really want to look it over and make sure this is a legitimate organization. So I did and took the jump. And it felt risky in those days because it was early. The role was for a head of psychology role. And a lot of that work was really cross-functional. So some of the earliest work was with data science, and it was really thinking about training algorithms to detect risk and clinical need. So I did that. I built out our QA and training function and then started to do a lot more strategic work, a lot more commercial facing work, which I loved. Became chief clinical officer at Ginger and then led through the merger with Headspace. was there around 7 years and loved it, but felt like I had kind of maxed out my learning and was excited to do something new. So I went to Included Health and really got to work deeply with other service lines. That was valuable because in so many settings, behavioral health is really siloed. So being able to work with primary care, urgent care, specialty care, that was incredibly valuable for me to really have that opportunity. And then the Nourish opportunity came along and it just felt like a no-brainer for many reasons. So here we are.
Totally. I love it. There's so much in your story that resonates. I think I probably use some of the same words when I tell mine, this move from academia to the entrepreneurial world and feeling frustrated on the one hand. And, for me, frustration has always been a source of inspiration. And it sounds like that was the same for you. Like you see what's not working. It's just like so deeply, I didn't realize that was so deeply entrepreneurial. That's like the DNA of entrepreneurs, right? I see a problem. I want to go fix it. But yeah, and that same feeling of jumping out of a very stable academic job and a lot of people around me going, what are you doing? But, years later, you've proven yourself right by taking the risk and the leap. And now, like all these years later, like you've led, I'd love to just dig into like the operations work, right? Because I do think like a lot of folks have, well, let's just call it what it is, like biases around clinician leaders overseeing large teams of clinicians, right? I mean, in hospitals, we do this all the time, but I do think there's sometimes some bias that makes people think that clinicians aren't great managers or clinicians can't be leaders. But I mean, you've led thousands of people, both W-2 employees, right, and 1099, and in a distributed workforce and in virtual settings, right? How did you come to be an operator? And like, how do you think about accountability and leadership in that environment where, you're not all in one building. You're distributed across the workforce.
Right. There's no sort of like break room where you can all go and consult or your supervisor's not down the hall. So the distributed setting is really different. It's very different to be a leader in that setting. I had been a leader in a brick and mortar setting, but it was really different at scale. The reality is, I think a lot of telehealth is learning by doing, and there was not a real playbook for me. So I was aware of some chief clinical officers. There weren't many in those days. There were some chief medical officers. None were from behavioral health that I was aware of. So a lot of folks that were from other parts of healthcare and medicine. So I had to kind of forge my own path, but a lot of it was trial and error and learning and doing and seeing what really worked over time. When it comes to the distributed nature, I think that's where it really took a lot of intentionality. So when you have, a workforce that is spread out all over the country, different types of providers. So at Ginger, for example, we had coaches, therapists, psychiatrists, some of whom were 1099, some were W-2. That's a lot of different types of providers and different stakeholders to think about. But every touch point you have really matters. So it's really important to get it right. And so that's from the beginning of, let's say, recruiting, to make sure you have the right messaging, that people really understand what the job is, what's being asked of them, how they'll be evaluated through hiring, through onboarding, through training. And then it's all about having the data. I think one of the most challenging things about being in this remote world is that it is hard to tell who is doing care well, who the high quality top performers are. Thankfully at Nourish, I feel like we have an amazing infrastructure. We've really been able to build this out so we do have a good eye at this. But I think early on in telehealth, some of those structures were not there. So it was difficult to really tell where quality issues were arising and to address them early on. So data is a huge part of it. And then in addition to the systems and tools, really making sure you can operate at scale, part of it is also around the culture. And that's really important, especially as telehealth has become much more competitive. When I started at Ginger, there were just not that many folks that were in the field. So we attracted great talent. We happen to have an amazing culture, but we really have to think about culture as a differentiator now because there are so many folks that are doing the same thing. And so that's everything from how do you structure meetings? Like, is there some time for chit chat at the beginning? Do you really welcome people talking about their families, their weekends? What's the tone of your email messaging? Things like that make a huge difference because you may not have any face-to-face time with people. So how do you reach them? And really making sure that you're kind of creating that culture that allows them to be their full selves. Russ Glass, who is the CEO at Headspace, I'm sure you know Russ and Robin. One of the things I really appreciated about him is he was very intentional around his non-work activities. So for example, he was taking keyboard lessons and he would talk about that. And he might have even played keyboard at a talent show we had once. And I loved that because I think he found it interesting when people were doing things outside of work. And that's an important part of culture so that people see leaders who are not just 24/7 working, but they are real humans. They have lives outside of work. And I think that makes people more productive and more engaged because they're living richer, happier lives. So then they show up in a different way in work. So you can kind of get the best of them. So that's a big answer. But I think it's both kind of systems, tools, messaging, but also really thinking about culture because that is what keeps people in a very competitive environment.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, you lead with yourself and like being you first and foremost, which I'm sure sprinkles down to your people and then out to the environment around you. Back to this point about learning to be an operator, right? I would just love to hear how, you said a little bit learning by doing and seeing like the people around you, like how did that come to be for you? And even in your pre-digital health days, pre-Ginger days, like, I think you were in positions where you were leading teams and, in the brick and mortar setting. So how did you know that that was work you wanted to do and how did you learn to do it?
Yes. So the bias is there. I think in some ways, actually, my training as a psychologist helped me a lot. So, as somebody that was trained in the scientific practitioner model, I was really very deeply schooled in research methodology. So I understood how to conduct research, how to produce research, and data was always really meaningful for me. I think in order to be a leader and an operator, you have to love data. You have to have an affinity for data. You have to see the value of it. And I think sometimes clinicians come in and they bring their clinical knowledge, but they're not thinking from a data-informed perspective. The other thing that clinicians have training in is really diagnostic. So we are trained to diagnose a problem, understand the root issue, and come up with a treatment plan. And that is really a lot of what running a business is. It's understanding what the core issue is, what the kind of potential solutions are, going through them to understand the ratio of resourcing to impact for each of those, and then coming up with a solution and really testing it out. So some of that foundational stuff is there, I think, for many clinicians. Where I feel like I was able to succeed is really translating clinical concepts to different stakeholders, being willing to be wrong and really being willing to partner cross-functionally. And I think that's hard for some clinicians because we are often in settings where we are the top dog or we are the one that is making the decision. And it's tough to be an early clinical leader because oftentimes, my role is to bring up things like patient safety and quality and things. And in an environment that is often around moving fast, coming up with quick solutions, testing them out, those things can feel at odds. So clinicians are often trained to be risk averse and they're trained to kind of like stick to their guns and come up with a decision because it is their license on the line. And when you're in a telehealth setting, working with various stakeholders like the commercial team, like product, you have to be willing to have those discussions and think about what the trade-offs are and then decide what hill you want to die on. I think that is a lot of being a clinical leader. There's some things like patient safety that we can't compromise on. And there's some things that we have to say there's some gray area. And maybe the way that medicine's been doing it for a long time is actually not working. So I'm going to take this fresh perspective from somebody who's not been in healthcare before, and it's going to inform my thinking. So I think being able to speak that language and work in that cross-functional capacity is the key to being a really good clinical leader and having success.
I love all those points. It's funny. I've been noodling on a blog piece that hopefully I've put the proverbial pen to paper on, and it's not quite done yet, but hopefully I'll get it out soon, which is like the learnings from our clinical training that really do translate to the business environment. And you're tapping into some of them actually, right? Like this idea of like being able to triage, right? And to know what needs to be done at A+, right? And what can wait or can be done at maybe an A- or a B+. This idea of tapping into the resources around you. I do think we are sometimes top dog often, but also like, as the general internists among us call consults all the time, like tapping into the expertise of the people around them to make sure they're appropriately addressing the needs of the patients. And yeah, so it's interesting. Like, I think there's a lot in what we learn and how we function as clinicians that we can actually translate if we're just mindful of those learnings and making sure we're utilizing them in this arena a little bit, differently. So I want to shift a little bit from the operational to the personal. And one of the things that I know about you, and you said the word already in our conversation, is that you've done things very intentionally. Like, you've used really an intentionality with your approach to the roles that you want and the way that you carry yourself. And I would just love to learn more about how you think about that word. It's so powerful, and how you've been intentional in finding your own authentic leadership voice and in your choice of, your career.
I think for me, what's been really important is that I feel like I'm living with integrity, that I am making decisions that are consistent with my values. And I think that comes from my orientation as a psychologist, my work in things like ACT, which is a methodology that really drives or is sort of founded around the idea of consistency with values and operating from that. So that's always been a core belief of mine. And it's one of the things that I think about when I'm evaluating jobs. Like, am I going to have integrity in this job? Do I feel as though the CEO and others on the leadership team have that level of integrity? How do I live that? So that's part of the intentionality. Part of the intentionality is also showing up in a way that is me. But what I'm aware of is that I am a fallible human and that I make mistakes and can learn. So I think authenticity is one of the words that I know we're sort of talking about a little bit, but that is such a tricky word because for some people, their authentic stance, right? Their tendencies may not actually be aligned with good leadership. They may be very brash. So being intentional and authentic don't always go together. Like, sometimes you have to be
so interesting.
Yeah. Like, sometimes it's like, who I would like to be in this moment is actually somebody that I don't want to show up in that way at work. I kind of want to read this person the riot act and I'm really mad. That's not going to be effective. And so I have to override that and say, what I really want to be is intentional in this moment. And I value this person. I value their relationship. We need to work together. So I'm going to do my best to really understand where they're coming from and why, so that we can partner on a solution. So that is often how I lead, is really trying to be thoughtful in that way, trying to be aware of my impact on others so that I can bring out the best in them. It doesn't mean I'm not going for what I want, because ultimately I want to get to a certain place, but I'm going to do it in a way that is really about being intentional and really prioritizing the relationship to the extent that I can.
Yeah. I if I'm honest, I probably practice that way, but I'm not sure I have articulated that. So I love that perspective of, it isn't just about authenticity. It's about being really thoughtful and intentional about, you might show up differently in different environments, but if you're doing it with purpose and intentionality, then it has meaning versus doing it for pretend, or being pushed in a direction by others versus taking yourself in that direction based on how you want to be. And as women, I think it's particularly interesting, right, for us as we carry ourselves in the business environment, right? Like, there's the challenge of bias again, of what we women are capable of, which is changing, thankfully. I heard a talk last week given by a middle-aged white male who was like, we need more women in leadership positions. We need more leaders who look like the purchaser of healthcare, and that's 80% women, right? And I was like, thank you. It's nice to have like a, middle-aged white male say that. But I know, I think like you as a woman and a leader and a clinician, right? Like, how have you been thoughtful about how you bring yourself to your leadership roles?
Yeah. I think there's also the compounding factor that for some folks, the bias is that because you're a mental health provider, you're more emotional, right? Mm-hmm. That you're more kind of even removed from healthcare generally. So that's another layer. But I think I have really had to kind of get in there and prove my value. It is not a given, right, that I am in a position of power and therefore I have to be listened to. It is about showing up and really doing the work, being thoughtful, and then delivering value. And that's outside the clinical realm. So one of the things that's been really important for me is not just overseeing a clinical team, thinking about quality and training and outcomes, but how do I deliver value to other parts of the company? So commercial, I do a lot of work with the commercial teams. That's really important to me. Product is something that I've worked integrally with over the years. So that is something that I think takes time to build up. That takes trust, that takes good ideas, and it takes people willing to be influenced. So I need to be able to influence them. They have to be willing to kind of let me in the room. One of the things I think about a lot for clinical leaders is this concept of Patrick Lencioni's first team.
Okay.
And in
Say more about that.
organizations, yeah, well, so the five dysfunctions of a team is his book, and it's just a classic book that you probably know. But one of the things that happens with clinical leaders often, I don't know if this is a gender thing or not, but they often are siloed to the clinical world.
Yes.
And I think that really for them to have most value, and the reason that organizations bring them in, they want that clinical viewpoint distributed across. So part of being an intentional leader is not just staying in my lane, but it's actually thinking, how do I influence these other parts of the business? And this first team idea is that for all executives or all leaders, they have to have the business first. And I think that's important as businesses scale, because when you're small, you can kind of work together. You have a lot of social camaraderie. There's a lot of kind of knowing each other. But as you scale, you really need the executives or the functional leads to be on the same page. And so that first team principle means that even though I'm responsible for representing clinical and advocating for clinical, I actually have to be on the same page with all these other functional leaders. So that is part of, I think, what is required that may not be obvious for some clinical leaders. And it may be a little harder for women to sometimes get in the room, right? You have to be able to talk like a product leader. You have to talk about data and resourcing. You have to be able to talk about margins and CAC, things like that, that are not obvious concepts to us, but we have to learn that language.
Yes. I mean, yes, you're preaching to the choir. I love it. I love it. Like this idea of like learning languages is so critical, right? Like and I think it goes both ways. Like I think other leaders owe it to us to like lean in to make sure they understand the way we work, the way we think, and the kind of words and language we choose. But it is on us too to make sure we're able to speak to our product peers and to our finance peers and to our commercial peers and contribute and participate in the decision making all across the business. I used to think of myself, or wanted to think of myself, and I think I became this, manifested it maybe, as a healthcare executive who happened to be a clinician and had a clinical acumen and background, right? But first and foremost, I think if you carry yourself as a healthcare executive, and as you said, the team first, like the business first, and bring your expertise to the table, I think is so key. It's such a great lesson for our clinician execs out there as they're navigating, for sure. I mean, I think this question of like clinicians trying to find their voice and being heard, right, comes up all the time. So I think, any other lessons that you would share with sort of aspiring clinician leaders who are trying to be in positions where they're not just siloed? What else would you add to what you just said in terms of lessons that you?
I think having some training. I took an online HBS course for basically healthcare leadership. That was helpful for me to learn some concepts. I don't think there's any substitute for just getting in there and making the connections and learning. So I think often, especially if I'm a sole clinical leader or early on in a company, how do I create coalitions? How do I find allies across the organization so that I can better understand if I'm getting pushback from a product team, I can know why, I can more deeply understand their perspective, they can understand mine. So I think a lot of it is, it's again, goes back to that very basic, that relational 101, developing those relationships and really understanding from the other person's perspective. I think it's hard if clinical leaders are just like, I'm going to go in there, I'm going to convince them. And especially if they're early, that doesn't work. I think I probably tried that early on.
Too. Like, I have the right answer. Why?
That's right.
Not know that this is the way we practice medicine.
Totally.
You're not trained to practice medicine. Of course you don't know. My job is to bring that perspective to you, not expect you to know it.
And I think connecting with other clinicians in the healthcare field, in health tech, is really important. I think it's hard to be an early or an only. And I think for me, I recently talked to another CCO, and I was just like, I'm struggling with this. And it was such a just welcome response. Like, I know what that's like. I've been there before, and just a little bit of guidance on how to think about things. So those things are really important. And I do think that we should use our networks and lean on each other to answer the hard questions, but also just for the more kind of emotional support, given that we're still, there aren't that many of us in the health tech world. So we are still kind of on our own in a lot of ways.
It's a great point. Like CEOs often say that, being a CEO is a really lonely spot. And I think that's true. And I do think being a clinician leader probably carries a little bit of that same sense of loneliness, right? Like you're the one standing up for what's right and fighting for and championing, the patient's needs. But there is a groundswell, right, of clinician leaders coming together to support one another. Still small, but increasingly mighty groups of people, I think, to support each other. And I think it's great. It's a great call out. There's physician communities, there's broader clinician communities, and we can tap into one another's expertise to support. I think it's great. I don't want to miss, as we're digging even deeper into, we went from operational to the sort of the personal way in which you carry yourself in a leadership world. But I want to double click even further on the personal, because you have a personal story that you bring to your work that is so powerful. And I would love to just, if you're open to sharing, share a little bit of your personal experiences in healthcare as a patient, and how, that has impacted how you've thought about your career and your leadership style.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've written pretty publicly about my experience with anorexia, which was in my sophomore year of college that developed. And it really it was life-changing for me in many ways, and really for the positive. But before that, I wanted to major in art history. I was studying French. I was going to school on the East Coast. And then I had this experience where I had a profoundly transformative experience. I basically had excellent care, and it shifted my worldview and my experience in so many ways. So I transferred to school in California. I started studying psychology. I started studying Spanish. Everything just changed for me. And it was on account of that really I went into this field, because I had this profoundly important experience about being helped and realizing that this was a career path for me that combined my love of science and data and helping people and really being a thought leader. So there was something super exciting to me around that as well, thinking about the field of eating disorders in particular. So that was my early work. I think telling our stories and coming forward with that, I mean, some people were sort of surprised that I talked about that. And for me, eating disorders are very often shrouded in shame. And I think that's not a unique experience. So telling the story, coming forward with it was part of the healing. I did it at a time when I already had a lot of distance from it. So I'd already had a lot of recovery. It felt very safe and very intentional again to do it. But it was important to me to be, and that is the word, maybe authentic there, but in that way, consistent as a leader, that I had been through this. And I think it's important for leaders to be seen as human, to be seen as, again, having lives, having vulnerabilities, being able to really admit when we're wrong or have challenges, because it's very easy to idealize folks. And I certainly didn't want people to be doing that with me. So it has been a really important part of my journey. At this point, it influences how I show up in the world, how I raise my daughters. I have a 15-year-old and a 17-year-old. So when I think about them facing the world, having to make decisions around food and their bodies, those things are really important. And in some ways, it's gotten easier for girls. In some ways, it's gotten much harder with social media. So that story is still part of me in a way, but it's also influenced my work, and not only how I lead, but then sort of coming full circle to Nourish, which has just been this amazing, kind of unpredictable thing. And Nourish does many things. So we are working with people that are focused on heart health and gut brain and healthy lifestyle decisions more broadly. So lots of reasons that people are coming to us. Eating disorders are one of them. But for me, what feels central is that many people, regardless of what the diagnosis or presenting problem is, there is this comorbidity between mental health and physical health issues. And so I'm really working at the intersection of that, because most people need to improve their relationship with food while they're working on their diabetes, while they're working on bringing down their A1C. So I think for me, it feels like it's just this lovely and, again, unanticipated full circle moment where I get to be back in this space and kind of take those learnings that really fuel me and give me passion for helping others in a new setting.
Yeah, I love that. And it's actually a good stepping stone into a topic that I wanted to mention, which is, full disclosure, we interacted very closely in your move from your last role to this one at Nourish, and which is such a joy to be in a position to support the Nourish team in finding support you in finding this like magical role that has like tied together all the pieces of your career puzzle here to have impact at scale. And I would love to just, talk a tad about like finding these career steps and like sort of moving from one thing to another and how you thought about your next chapter, as a search professional now, I'm in this sort of fun role of like helping matchmake and helping great people, great companies come together. But, how did you think about a next role and how were you thinking about mission and fit and the environment? If you were to give advice to other clinician executives who are thinking about new opportunities, like what helped you clarify what kind of organization you'd want to join? And what advice would you give to others as they're thinking about that?
Yeah, well, I think the number one thing is always take the call. So if you get
yeah, this was unexpected when we chatted. We weren't expecting you
right, right.
to take it.
Exactly. So I think just having conversations is really important. And that's what I have done in any job search. I have talked to hundreds of people in different companies, VCs, founders. It's just really important to have the conversations and to understand what the options are and what people are doing. Most of the time, they don't lead to anything, but once in a while, you will strike gold or you will sort of like, be invited to participate in something and sort of the stars align. But I think for me, what is important is, again, this sort of sense of integrity. I'm doing something that I believe in. That's really important. That's pretty easy in healthcare, honestly, because most companies are meeting that bar. But for me, there are other things that are really important, like looking at the leadership team. Do I trust them? Do I like them? Can I imagine working with them? We spend a lot of time together, and that's really important. Things like clinical quality is also really important. There's a lot of companies who really talk about that. For me, it was important to get under the hood and really understand that. Are they really following through on that? Are they walking the walk on that? Those things were important. And then there is something just around kind of chemistry that's important, I think, when you're, meeting a new team. Do you sort of feel that safety? Do you connect with them in that way? So those for me were the things. It's sort of the mission. It was the leadership team. I mean, Nourish had a ton of traction in a very short period of time. So it gave me a lot of confidence that the business was doing well. That's important also. I think it's easy to sort of find a company that you're interested in, but you do want to make sure that they have enough cash runway, that they have really solid plans, that they're not kind of running on fumes. So you don't get there and then realize, oh, things are not going so well. Because I do know that folks have gotten into that before. That happens.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, unless you're willing to take the risk. I mean, there certainly are people for whom that early stage, before there's product market fit, before there's even a product, right?
Yes.
Can be appealing, but it isn't for everybody. You have to kind of know yourself and what stage of company and what level of risk you're willing to tolerate and
yep. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. So much more than title and scope of role in a job description. So I love your perspective on really getting under the hood and really understanding the team, the outcomes, the culture, whether it's the right fit and the right stage for you. So I appreciate that. Well, before we close up, maybe a little we've double clicked and gone down deep, but maybe we just take a little 10,000-foot view. And I'd love your perspective as now a seasoned digital health clinician executive on where you think we're going from here forward. I mean, we're at this amazing pivotal juncture. 2 years ago, we would never have thought AI would be as profoundly impactful as it has been. Like, who knows what 2 years from now will look like? What do you see as you look into your crystal ball for what's coming? What opportunities on the one hand, but maybe what pitfalls bringing our clinician exec voices? Like, are you saying looking at the future?
Yeah, well, I wish I had a crystal ball. So, Reena, if you figure out like where to get one, let me know. I think, it's real. I think a lot about AI and think about in the past, we were just thinking about scribes or creating efficiencies. And it was very basic around clinician workflows. And now, I mean, it is not far away that we will have AI involved in treatment decision-making and prescribing. And that is both exciting and scary. And so I really think this is a time for clinicians to be in the room. It's so important that we have people that are involved in medical ethics, that we have legal teams, that we have clinicians in those settings where we are really asking the tough questions, making sure that patient safety is top of mind. I talked to an early stage company at one point. They had developed an entire AI protocol. We're launching it. It was already in market and no clinicians had been involved. That was such a red flag for me because we do have a really important lens and an important voice. And so we have to have a seat at the table. So that's sort of a rallying call. I think clinicians are getting more comfortable with AI. I think early on, I felt like people are afraid of it, but they're also not engaging. And that's the most dangerous situation, right? Because then we're not part of the conversation. We can't shape it and make sure that it is rolled out in an appropriate and ethical way. I do see more engagement recently. So that feels very heartening that I think there's more of a recognition that this is coming. We have to get on board. We have to make sure that it's done correctly. And so we're really thinking about all those things at Nourish. You know, how do we make sure that we are being ethical and responsible, but also using AI to increase access, to increase quality care. So those things are really top of mind. And I'm seeing that across the board.
I love it. This is probably a great spot to end. Just with you're peering into the crystal ball, and I think you're spot on. I think we need our clinician voices at the table to be thoughtful about how to use technology. Technology will be there. It's happening. We're already on the bandwagon, right? It's just about how to do it right and do it in the most thoughtful and intentional way, to come back to that word. Well, with that, I just owe you a huge thank you for joining me today. It's so fun to hear your story. It's been so fun to watch your rise and the continued impact that you have. I recall when we met one another for the first time in Atlanta in the lobby of the Delta Airlines corporate offices, where we were both pitching our respective behavioral health solutions to the employer benefits team. That was a long time ago, and it's so fun to be now in a position to not be on different, competitive sides of the table, but the same side of the table, pushing for, great clinical leaders to be in great positions to drive change and innovation in healthcare. So with that, thank you. I appreciate you.
Thank you, Reena. You are a role model, and I just really feel honored to be on this show. So thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Leadership Rounds, where clinician executives share wisdom and insights on what it means to be an exceptional leader in healthcare. If you enjoyed today's discussion, please subscribe, comment, and share with your friends and fellow leaders in healthcare. Join us next time for another dose of leadership wisdom. Until then, I'm Dr. Reena Pande. Thanks for listening.